It's like a Hazan. It's
Okay.
like a Hazan, you know?
Today we are going to continue studying our book, Jewish Wisdom. We're going to study chapter 43, and the topic is very interesting. Yeah, we're going to start with bless. Okay. Thank you, Jackie. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Today we're going to study a very interesting chapter. The title is very thought-provoking. It's called, Is God Necessary for Morality? Is God necessary for morality? Meaning, can a person who is an atheist or a non-believer be a good and moral and ethical person? Or do you need to believe in God in order to be a good person? Okay, so that's going to be the topic for today. And I would like to do two things. I would like to read a few paragraphs from here, from this book, but also I would like to discuss with you a chapter from this book. This book is called Contemporary Jewish Religion Thought. It was edited by two great scholars, Arthur Cohen and Paul Mendes-Flohr. I had the opportunity to meet Paul Mendes-Flohr in person. Actually, I hosted him at home for a while, and here's his handwriting, if you would like to see it. So he dedicated this book, and we're going to study a chapter that was written by a great scholar. His name is Shalom Rosenberg. He taught, or he's still teaching, at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He was born in the Holy Land of Argentina in Latin America, and he made Aliyah when he was young, and he continues to teach there at the Hebrew University, and he teaches Jewish philosophy. So that's what I would like to do today. And the way that I would like to discuss the topic is to talk a little bit about ethics and morality and see how Jewish tradition understands it and how modern Jewish theology and how modern Jewish philosophy understands the idea of ethics and morality, and see if God is necessary for people to behave in a moral and ethical way or not. Okay? So let me pass this around for a moment. And let's see. So like just in order to trigger the conversation and the discussion, I would like to read the very first part of this chapter. It's a very short chapter. So page 290. Who would like to read? Debbie,
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay. In the 19th century, the problem was that God was dead. In the 20th century, the problem is that man is dead, said Eric Fromm.
Right, so Nietzsche created this whole... good morning. Nietzsche created this whole idea that God is dead. And actually, we have a great Jewish scholar here who's a member in our congregation, who is the Jewish scholar about the topic of the death of God, Richard Rubinstein. May God bless him with a long life. And so that's part of the discussion here. Go ahead.
A popular argument against religion is that many evils have been perpetrated in its name, but it seldom is noted that the two most murderous societies in history, the Nazis and the Soviet communists, were aggressively atheist. Hitler declared his life mission the destruction of the tyrannical God of the Jews, while during the 73-year history, the Soviet Union made it a crime to advocate belief in God. The death of God to which Fromm refers was a notion first articulated by the late 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. At about the same time, Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote in The Brothers Karamazov, if there is no God, all is permitted.
Right, so that's interesting, right? Because that's the tension between morality and God. If there is no God, some people feel like everything is permitted, but so many crimes and so many evil things have been perpetrated in the name of religion. Right? So how do we understand that tension between both? how do we understand that relationship between ethics, morality, and the belief or not in God. Okay, let's take a quick look from a Jewish perspective. Go ahead.
From Judaism's perspective, Dostoevsky's comment is a logical conclusion. If there is no God, who is to say that anything should be prohibited? To this day, there is ultimately no philosophically compelling answer to the question, why was Hitler wrong, aside from because God said so? Bertrand Russell, this century's most prominent secular philosopher himself, articulated the dangers of a God-free subjective ethics. I cannot see how to refute the arguments for the subjectivity of ethical values, but I find myself incapable of believing that all that is wrong with wanton cruelty is that I don't like it. Although Russell lived well into his 90s, he never was able to produce a more compelling argument against wanton cruelty than that he didn't like it. Unfortunately, a considerable number of people do.
Right. So what do you think about this topic? Do you think that God is necessary for morality, or people can achieve a high level of behavior and ethics without believing in God necessarily?
I would hope so.
You would hope so?
I would hope so.
So what's the role of God within this whole topic?
A role model.
Role model, okay. An inspiration, maybe, okay.
Check on
Wait.
your
What does that
impulses.
mean, God is a role model? I'm not sure what that means.
How do you define God?
Right. How do you define God?
The attributes of God are supposed to be compassionate and loving, etc. And
Supposed to be.
who knows?
Who knows, right? Who knows? I don't know.
Okay, all right.
Okay, and that's actually part of what we will be discussing later today. And I would like to show you at least 3 different approaches to modern Jewish philosophy, and as Shalom Rosenberg says here, to attempt to apply certain modern categories to the study of classical Jewish ethics. Okay, so I hope that analyzing these 3 different ideas about ethics and morality, we can get to an answer to the question if God is necessary or not for morality. Where we don't have time to read the entire chapter or even to analyze the entire chapter, so I'm going to direct you to some parts that I believe are important for us, and we're going to discuss those. And I apologize that it's all marked, but
That's okay. That's okay.
I read this book many times and I love it. It's a great book. So it says here, do you have the copies? It says here, my purpose is to attempt to apply certain modern categories to the study of classical Jewish ethics. This is a dangerous enterprise because we are entering the minefield of anachronism. Nevertheless, I think it can produce fruitful results. I would like to show first of all that in classical Jewish philosophy there are several different ethical theories, 4 of which will be discussed here, namely, and we will try to decode them, the deontological, teleological, and anthropological ethical theories, and ethics conceived as imitatio. Okay, so the first idea here is the deontological theory. It says here, it's based on the premise that we cannot reduce moral values to natural goodness, happiness, and sufferance. Rather, there are considerations that render an action right or wrong, other than the goodness and badness of its consequences. So what's the difference between something right and something wrong, and something good and something bad? Or something that makes you happy or something that makes you suffer? Right, so that's the first category that Shalom Rosenberg is proposing here. And I think that that's related to one of the stories that we read last week, the creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and the and the first sin, if you would like to call it that way. Because according to Maimonides, what happened then is that Adam and Eve, when they were created, they were in a very high spiritual and moral category. And they were in the category of what we call true and false. Meaning they understood and they knew what was true and what was false in the world. But then, says Maimonides, after they ate from the tree of knowledge and the good and evil, they descended a category. And they stopped to be in the higher category of what is true and what is false, but they were reduced to the category of what is good and what is bad. And so Maimonides says that these two categories are different because what is true and what is false are objective categories. I mean, for most of people, what is true and what is false, most people would agree with that. But what is right and what is wrong, or what is nice and what is ugly, are subjective categories. Right? So what Shalom Rosenberg is telling us is that Jewish ethics are aimed to bring us to the first level and to tell us what is true and what is false, rather than telling us what is right, what is wrong, or what is nice and what isn't nice, what is beautiful and what isn't beautiful to me. Because that could be different for many people. Right? So that's the first idea. The first idea would be that ethics and God is necessary because God would bring us to that higher level of knowing what is true and what is false, and how we should act in this world to make this world a better place. Okay? So that's a quick summary of this first idea. Then if you go to page 197, you're going to see the second idea. And the second idea is what he calls the teleological idea or model. And this theory, are you following me? Mm-hmm. Yeah. This theory appears throughout Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim, as well as in his halachic works. We find it expressed in other medieval thinkers as well, for instance, in the writings of Abraham ibn Daud and Yehuda Halevi. We can describe this type of morality as a set of minimal conditions needed to sustain any human society, right? So how would you define this idea? What would be the minimum conditions to sustain any human society? Can you think of any of those conditions?
Yeah, the Ten Commandments.
Okay, the Ten Commandments would be the common ground, right, to create any good society.
Yeah.
Okay, or things like do not murder, right? Because if people would murder each other all the time, we wouldn't have any kind of society. So what Rosenberg says here is that according to a medieval philosophical commonplace, even a gang of thieves must have a minimal ethical code in order to survive. Right? So even, the worst people in the world, they need to have a minimum code of conduct in order to behave, or to organize their gangs in this case, right? Or their clans or their groups. So according to this second idea, ethics and morality would be the minimum code, the minimum conduct that we need in order to have a human society. Okay? And the third idea, the third type, the anthropological conception of ethics, we could consider it, okay, so let's skip to the next page because he does not define it there, but he says, if you see there, finally, the anthropological theory sees the true aim of ethics as a psychodrama, that is, the perfection of the individual human soul. So these are not conditions that are outside of human beings or that the society would seek for them, but these are conditions that your own soul would seek for them. So, for example, the idea of kindness, the idea of love, the idea of helping those who are in need. Those won't come necessarily from believing in God, but they would come because you are a human being, right? And you care about others. Okay? So it's interesting to summarize these three theories. The first one is the idea that ethics will help us to get to a level where we can find what is a common place for everybody, what we call now true and false, right? Objective categories that would help the world to move on and to run the world. The second would be the minimum ideas or a common ground that would help us to behave better in this world. And the third one would be something that is coming from within ourselves, from within our own perspective and understanding of the world itself. But the one that I really like is the fourth one. That is what we call imitatio Dei. And I have talked about this many times. It's on page 201. And if you're interested, you can take this copy with you and take a look at home. The language is a little complicated sometimes, but it's a very deep article and very interesting. So it says here, page 201, a fourth ethical theory is now apparent, ethics as imitatio Dei, close to what Wally was saying, which represents the ideal type of religious morality. And I'm skipping where it's underlined. Man's imitation of God is expressed above all in his role as leader. True chesed, mishpat, and tzedakah come into being through the imitation of God. Indeed, one of the central commands or commandments in Judaism is the imitation of God, and you shall walk in God's ways. So what would be the role of morality, according to this fourth idea? Would be that God is the source of morality. And as we were created in the likeness and image of God, we should also be that source of morality and ethics in this world. And you know, one of my favorite passages that is in the Mishnah or in the Talmud, you remember that there are two verses in the book of Deuteronomy that apparently are contradicting each other. And one verse says that we should, actually it's this one from chapter 28, says that we should walk close or near to God. And then the other verse says that God is a fire that consumes, that will kill you, right? So the Talmud asks, how could it be that the Torah is asking you to walk close to God if God is a fire that will consume you, right? So how can you walk near to God, or how can you walk close to God? If you do that, what's going to happen to you? You're going to die because you're going to be burned. So what's the answer that the Talmud gives? It's not that you have to walk near God. It's that you have to walk through the same paths or imitate the same actions that God performed in this world. And there are 4 examples. And I have mentioned this to you many times, but I think it's good to refresh it. And what are the 4 examples that are quoted there? Do you remember the first one? That's the second. The first one is God clothing the naked. And we read it last week, that after expulsing them from the Garden of Eden, God himself, or herself, right, made clothes for Adam and Eve. The Torah says, Vayal Vishem, meaning that God himself is concerned about the future of Adam and Eve, and God is taking care of them by making clothes and interacting with human beings, clothing them and helping them. So the Talmud says, the same way you should take care of those who are naked. Then the second one is when God himself or herself visited Abraham after his Brit Milah. And the Talmud says, as God was concerned with those who were sick, you should also be concerned with or about those who are sick, and you should visit them. So what you should do is to imitate the actions of God in this world. And that's the source of morality and ethics. And then the third example is, do you remember?
Feed the hungry.
Blind,
The what?
don't put a stumbling block.
No,
That's not it.
close to it.
Take care of the widow and orphans.
Close to it. There's another category. Visit those who are in mourn.
Morning.
So, as God visited Isaac after the loss of his father Abraham and comforted him, so we should also comfort those who are suffering. And we do that, right? That's what we call in Jewish tradition, Nihum Avelim. So comforting those who are having a tough time. And which is the last one? This is very well known and famous. God himself buried Moses. And that's why nobody knows where Moses is buried. So God took care of burying Moses because no one was there to bury him. So the Talmud says you should also help those who don't have a relative or a friend who would bury them in, I would say, a Jewish cemetery, right? And that's why the Hevra Kadisha, that's why the Holy Society is so important in Jewish tradition, following this idea, because what we are doing when we are taking care of someone who doesn't have the means or the money to bury a relative and we are helping them, what we are doing is we are imitating the presence and the actions of God in our world. And that's why when Jewish people moved from one place to another, one of the first things that they would establish was a cheder, a Jewish, well, of course, a synagogue, right? So a Beit Filah, a place where to pray, a place where to study Torah for them and for their children,
And a cemetery.
And a cemetery, and a Hevra Kadisha,
Not a mikvah.
and a mikvah. And many other things, right? That and write a Sefer Torah and get a pair of tefillin and talis, right? So it's
A
endless.
kosher butcher.
Get a coach, right. So get a kosher butcher. But those were the most basic and important things that Jewish people needed in order to organize their life as a community, right? And a cemetery was one of them. So let's go back to the question that Rabbi Telushkin is asking us this morning. Is God necessary for morality? My answer would be maybe. For me, yes. I think that God is necessary for morality because it will enhance our moral practice or behavior here in this world. God is certainly necessary, but for some people, God is not necessary, right? You don't need to believe in God in order to be a good person. It's not necessary for some people. But for me, it's necessary because I think that it will enhance your moral and ethical behavior in this world by the different categories that Shalom Rosenberg presented to us very briefly this morning. And those are the common ground that we need in order to organize any society, right? And those could come from the outside, meaning a group of people that would find those categories as they organize themselves as a society, or that would come from within yourself, meaning since you were created in the image and likeness of God, you would act accordingly because you have a need of behaving in that way and behaving as a moral and ethical person or human being that was created in the image and likeness of God. So I just want to conclude by saying that morality could also be subjective, right? So what is ethical and moral for one society could not be for another society, right? So for example, offering your child to Dagon or to any other god, right, would be immoral and unethical for us, but it was moral and ethical for other societies. Or having slaves, or trading human beings, or selling them, or buying them, right? What would be considered unethical or non-moral for one society or for one period of time in our own society could change going forward, and it could change in the future. But I think that God would bring a component of what is right and wrong for most of people in a certain society. So
So some people would say if you're not vegetarian, you're eating flesh.
correct. Correct. And that's why you need laws, and that's why you need a common ground to order the society, and in our case, to order our religion in a common ground that is common for everyone who professes or everyone who have that particular faith or is part of that particular society. And that's where God gets in the picture to me.
What about humanistic Judaism? What do they say?
I don't know exactly, but I would guess that it's not necessarily to practice the ritual in order to be a good person or a moral person. But I don't know where's the place of God there, because one thing are the rituals and another thing is the belief on God. We could ask a humanistic Jew if he or she believes in God, despite of fulfilling or not the mitzvot. I don't know. I don't know if anybody's
Or any Jew. You can
or any Jew. Yeah, or any Jew. So another question is, the observance of mitzvot would make us more better people or more ethical and moral people than not fulfilling the commandments? What's the difference? And I always ask this to my religious school students. What's the difference between visiting someone who's sick and Bikur Cholim? What is the difference between just giving money or giving tzedakah? Or what's the difference between hosting a friend at home and achnasat orchim, and welcoming the stranger? Is there any difference there?
I guess it depends.
Well, there's a difference between welcoming a friend and welcoming a stranger.
Yeah, well,
Right.
I mean, in the sense of the action that you are doing, right? So, okay, so let's put them in the same category. So, is there any difference between welcoming a stranger and the idea or the notion of the mitzvah of achnasat orchim?
I guess it depends in your mind why you're doing what you're doing.
Correct. And I agree with you. I think that it won't necessarily affect the outcome of the action, but it will affect and change you. And why are you doing it? Are you doing it only because it is the right thing to do, or are you doing it because you feel commanded by God or your religion or any other source of goodness to do that?
What your parents taught you.
Right, or what your parents taught you. So I think, and that's when you start adding some religious categories and some religious components to your life. That I think it not necessarily will affect the outcome of the action, but it will give you a different perspective of life. And I'm going to say it again. It will not necessarily affect the outcome of the action, but it will give you a different perspective of your life. And I think that's where ethics and morality and God come into the equation.
And if there were no God, it would be difficult to have an imitatio Dei.
Well,
Nothing to imitate.
well, there's nothing to imitate, to emulate. Yeah, that is right. Okay, well, it was a shorter class today because it was Rosh Chodesh, but I would love to hear if there are any comments or questions here.
I'm not that familiar with the Muslim religion, but this whole business about, going to heaven because you killed people who aren't, is that part of their...
Well, that's a radical reading of the Quran. Most Muslims will not say that. And as we have radical readings of the Torah and radical readings of the New Testament, unfortunately, we have radical readings of the Quran with people who are willing to kill themselves or bomb themselves in order to kill other people to go to paradise with a number of virgins. But that's certainly a radical reading of the text itself.
What kind of morality or ethical standing did, say, the Nazis have?
Well, maybe for Hitler, he was doing the right thing, right? It was ethically and moral to kill the Jews because he was cleaning and cleansing the world.
To get to the perfect race that he
To-
believed in.
correct.
Correct.
So again, that's why I think that these ethical and moral categories could be very subjective and not objective. And that's where you need religion. And that's where you need God in order to give a common compass to what is right and wrong for human beings.
Did Hitler go to church?
I don't know.
Right, but he did go to hell.
Okay, thank you everybody. We will continue the discussion next week.